Welcome to our class for today. In today's class, we are going to look at finally the squares. And today's class will conclude our discussions on the square roots and squares of numbers. Today we are going to consider the square root of the square of a number. We're going to look at how to find square of a number, and finally we're going to look at the difference between square and square root. That's going to be an exciting one because you'll come to know the differences between square and square root, and that will no longer be a problem for you. So if you are part of our community, our members community, I want to say well done for being part of this community, and I encourage you to continue to be part of our member. And if you are not a member, try as much as possible to click the link in the description section of this video to join our membership platform in order to get our exclusive members only videos and also a members only live stream. That will be exciting. Now let's consider the square of a number. We're going to look at the square of a number, and we're going to consider what a square of any number is. This is going to be like a revision because we've touched this in our various classes on the square root. Now any number that is raised to exponent 2 is called the square of the base. Now if the base is y and y is raised to an exponent of 2, we say this is y squared. Now if this is 5, the base, and 5 is raised to the power of 2, we say this is what? 5 squared. So any number raised to an exponent 2 is what is called the square of that number. So square of 5 is simply what? 25, right? Square of 5 is 25. And when we talk about the square of 8, the square of 8 is also what? 64, right? So that is that, and all this is referred to squares. So we can easily find the squares of numbers by just multiplying that number by itself. So 5 squared is simply equal to 5 multiplied by 5, and that gives you what? 25. So that is that. Now also note that when we find the square root of a whole number, the value we get is always a perfect square. So perfect square are gotten from the squares of numbers. Now imagine we finding the square of 5. This number 25 is a perfect what? Is a perfect square. This number 64 is a perfect square. So perfect square of numbers are gotten from the squares of numbers. So some of the perfect squares we have are 4. When we have 2 squares, that gives us 4. When we have 3 squares, that gives us 9. When we have 4 squares, that gives us 16. When we have 5 squares, that gives us 25. When we have 6 squares, that gives us what? 36. When we have 7 squared, that gives us 49. And when we have 8 squared, that gives us what? 64. So all these are the perfect squares of number. So whenever you're asked to find the perfect square of number, all you simply need to do is to take the square of that number, and then you can perfectly find the perfect squares. So that is that. So with this in mind, I would want you to look at the perfect square of numbers from 11 to 20. Now I know you can absolutely do that. Take out your time, find out the perfect square of number 11 to 20, and that simply means having 11 multiplied by 11, which is 11 squared, having 12 multiplied by 12, which is 12 squared, and having 13, 14, and so on and so forth. So that is what we call the square of a number. Now how can we find the square of a number? Let's look at how we can find the square of a number, just as we have explained in this. So Finding the square of a number is also very easy. The square of a number can be found by multiplying that number by itself. We have said that. So for single digit number, you can find the square of that single digit number like 7, like 6, like 9 by multiplying that number by itself. Now, if these are double digit numbers, we can find, in the case of multiplication of such number, we can find the square root of such numbers like 12 by multiplying that number, 12 multiplied by what? By 12. And if it is a 3-digit number like 121, we can multiply 121 by 121, and that will give us the what? That will give us the square of that number. So the square of any number can be gotten by multiplying that number by itself. If it is a single digit number, you multiply it by its single digit number. If it is double digit or multiple digit number, you have to multiply them using the multiplication of what? Of numbers. Now, generally, I want you to note something, that squares, just as we have said earlier on, squares is just the inverse of square root, and square root is just the inverse of square. So whenever I have a number 3 and I have 9, when I take the square of 3, I'll get what? 9, and that is 3 what? Square. And whenever I take the square root of 9, that is this, I'm going to get what? 3. So, as I said earlier on, as I taught you in this class, that the square of a number is what? Is the inverse of the square root of the number. So, the square of any number is always written by what? Raising the exponent of that number by what? By 2, just as we have seen in all the examples we've talked about. What about finding the square of a negative number? We have a negative number 6 and it is raised to the power of 2. Now you can find the square of this number by multiplying that number by itself. It doesn't change. This is negative 6 multiplied by negative 6. Now negative multiplied by negative will give you what? Positive, right? 6 multiplied by 6 is going to give us what? 6 multiplied by 6 is going to give us 36. So negative 6 square is going to simply give us positive 36. And what if the number is a fraction? Like we have 5 divided by 3 square. All you simply need to do to find the square root of this fraction is to multiply the fraction by itself. So this is going to give me 5 divided by 3 multiplied by 5 divided by 3. And 5 divided by 3 multiplied by 5 divided by 3 will give us times 5 will give us 25. And then 3 times 3 will give us 9. 3 here will give us 3. And then 3 in 25 can give us what? 25, can it go in 3? Can we divide 25 by 3? No, that's not possible. So our result will be 25 divided by 9. And that is our result. So what this is generally telling us, that we can find the square root of number by simply multiplying that number by itself. And that is that. So let's look at the squares and square root, and let's look at the difference between the squares and square root. When you are given squares and you are given square root, although in all our lessons we've looked at the differences between the squares and square root, but this final part is going to help you understand the differences, especially when you're working with algebra. And when you start working with algebra, you start looking at seeing or simple equations on algebra, you start seeing the importance of this. I'm going to show you now. The square is a very strong, the squares and square root have very strong relationship. And this tie cannot easily be broken because each of them is just the inverse relation of the other. Now, if I have the value y and I'm told that y is equal to x squared. What does that simply tell me? That tells me that my x is simply equal to the square root of y. So you see, we've gotten square root from y. So their relationship is very strong. You can never break them. So this can be very, very similar to anything you are doing in algebra. Now, to remember this, I'm going to give you just 2 tips to help you remember how to play around squares and square root. And what is that? Tip 1. To remove squares, let us square root both sides. Always remember this. If you want to remove square in any expression, you have to what? Square both sides. Now, if you are given any algebra expression and they give you your x squared to be equal to 16 and you are asked to find the value of x, that's very simple. All you simply need to do is to remember the relationship with squares and what? And square root. Remember, to clear off square, all you simply need to do is to square root the both sides. So if I square root the both sides with x what? Square, and this is equal to the square root of 16. This square will cancel out the square root and I will be left with just x, and you know the square root of 16 is 4. So the value of my x is just simply equal to 4. So you see, that rule definitely works. So to remove square, all you need to do is to square root what? To square root both sides. That's rule 1. Now, in rule 2, we also have to remember that to remove the square roots, since they are inverse, you simply have to do what? To square both sides. Now, let me tell you this. If you are given the square of y and you are told that the square of y is equal to 5 and you are asked to find the value of y, what do I need to do? I have what? To square both sides. And this will give me what? 5 what? Square. And you always remember that the square root will always cancel the square. So my y will be equal to 5 squared is what? Is 25. So you see, this is rule 2. And this is rule 1. This rule is very unique. And when you use it, you can simply solve any question in what? In algebra. So, what are you waiting for? Play along with this logical rule, use them in solving equations in algebra, and then see how simple algebra will be for you. Now, let us highlight some few differences between squares and square root. If you are with your pen and pad, then take note of this. Now, when we talk about squares, squares always have what we call the exponent symbol. But square root will always have the symbol of a radical. That's the simple difference between them. Now, when we talk about the result, square will only give you a positive result. But square root can be positive and negative. Now, remember in that class, I told you that the result of the square of any number is a positive and a negative number. But however, in most cases, people always take up the what? The positive number. So square root will always give you a positive and or a negative number. Now, what does it have to do with the inverse? We have learned that the inverse of square is what? Square root. And the inverse of square root is just simply square. Now, we've also learned that the perfect square can be gotten from what? From square root. So when we use perfect square, can be getting from the squares of number. But then if we want to find the square root of numbers, we can simply put that number in the radical sign, and then the square of that number, the result we get, can give us the value of the number in that radical. So all these are just the differences between squares and squares. And I know you've taken note of these differences and you've penned them down. And that will bring a complete end to our video lessons on squares and square root. Now, this series of questions is meant for you to practice all what you've learned after all the series of video lessons you have watched on that number series. The general question is, you choose all the options that represent square root of a thing. Is it option A, option B, or option C, or none of the above? You can have 2 or 3 more answers in this, so make sure you choose your options wisely. The question 2 says you should determine the square root of 80 using prime factorization method. We have discussed prime factorization in one of our videos, and I want you to look at that video and then see how you can answer that question. Question 3 asks you to find the square root of the following using any method: the square root of 25, square root of 20, square root of 16, and square root of 400. So do work on this question and drop your answers in the comment section. And if you are part of our members community, then you must be in our classroom where you can submit such questions, and then we'll do a review and then a feedback of your answers, and then that will help you to improve on all what you have learned on that square root. If you haven't joined our membership platform, don't forget to click the link below in order to join our membership platform, and don't forget to also share these videos with your friends if you have them, and encourage them to also join our membership platform so that they can have exclusive perks and exclusive videos, exclusive online live streaming on all the topics you can think of in grade 9 mathematics. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you watch our subsequent video. In our next topic, we'll be discussing cube root, and this is a topic under number theory. I look forward to seeing you watch that video lessons very soon. Thanks so much for watching, and bye bye for now.